respond. I'm still down for that. I'm just gonna have to respond later because of some minor technological snafus that are happening on my end, but I'm still really happy to be here with everyone.
Well, as you know, Tadisha and I have been, we've survived the Great Texas Winter event, and Toniesha's still dealing with some after effects of that. So internet's a little spotty, so we'll see if we can get through this. I'm actually happy with you to tweet at me as well, and we'll respond afterwards. The other thing I wanted to say is on my website, which is listed there, I always put up an open access copy of all my work. I've found that sometimes, depending on what university you're associated with, you can't get to scholars' work. And I'm a big believer in that we need to have scholarship accessible that we're doing, especially for those of us who work at land grant institutions as part of our core mission. So I like to just remind people that anything I've ever published is available, including my monograph, for free on an open access basis. So might as well get started. As I was looking back through my notes and my presentations and the writing that we did as we moved from what was our first collaborative presentation on this project, which was in 2014 at the Swiss Digital Humanities Conference, I thought it might be helpful to kind of start with what we thought then and work our way forward. So let me just remind you, if you haven't had a chance to look at the essay, of what we said when we first talked about our venture. We wrote, in Earhart's recent essay, Can Information Be Unfettered? Race in the New Digital Humanities Canon, Earhart critiques the digital canon that skews toward traditional text and excludes crucial work by women, people of color, and the GLBTQA community, advocating an activist model of grassroots recovery projects to expand current digital offerings. In response to such concerns, Earhart and Taylor are currently testing a digital recovery project entitled White Violence and Black Resistance in Texas. This year's conference theme is Digital Cultural Empowerment, a theme directly related to our testbed project, which emphasizes the expansion of cultural capital and digital literary skills through our model pedagogical project. We view our project as connected to interventions into current structures of production through the digitization and dissemination of materials about white violence and Black resistance found buried in difficult to access rare book rooms, crumbling newspapers, analog and or transcribed oral histories, and unknown journals. Our ongoing project presents an activist model grounded in the classroom where undergraduate students are active participants in canon expansion while learning valuable research and digital literary skills, a model we believe other digital humanists interested in canon expansion and digital pedagogies might replicate. Now, that's what we said then. And I think what we said was really important, but in reflection, probably what was even more important than the project and the recovery that we did was the lessons that we learned about power in institutions, particularly structural powers, which are incredibly difficult to shift. And I think really are resonating at this moment, as in the United States in particular, but also around the world. I know the UK is having discussions of these same issues. So this original collaboration, what we said of it was, our testbed of Texas A&M University and Prairie View A&M University provides an important site of intervention. Historically, the two universities were divided by race during segregation and finance. Though the state constitution in Texas states that we are both, quote, universities of the first class, this has not been true in funding and resources. Rather, the campuses have continued to be marked by the separations of race and resources, which creates a space where Texas A&M is constructed as the predominantly white institution, PWI, Research One institution, and Prairie View a historically Black or HBCU teaching university. We reject the negative differentiations and view projects like our current work as a way of disrupting such binaries, using carefully constructed technological projects to spread digital cultural empowerment through both universities and student bodies. Here we agree with the FemTechNet white paper, which states that We seek to activate a learning process that recognizes and extends across global and cultural context. While the use of the World Wide Web and internet infrastructures enables communications among peoples at great geographical distances, it also strains the capacity for respect and the appreciation of the nuances of diverse backgrounds, which increases the intensity of the work that must be done by teachers and organizers of the learning process. And I'm sure that really reverberates with all of us, especially at this moment. I'm going to now turn it over to Toniesha.
Okay, so looking at the way that these two universities are set up, as Amy just talked about, both universities are actually land-grant universities. So they're both set up through the Morrill Act, which the first act was in 1862, and then the second one was in 1890. So in 1862, as you can, and actually both acts use this, start from the same place, right? So the purpose of the land-grant college in the United States is, and I quote, and this comes straight from the bill actually, without excluding other scientific and classical studies and including militaristic tactic, which I want you to underline, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture, also underline that, and the mechanic arts in such a manner as the legislatures of the states may respectfully prescribe in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits of professional life. So for land-grant universities in the United States, their primary goal is military tactics, agriculture, mechanics, and then after that, along with that, the classics and sort of the social sciences kind of come in a kind of further down the road implementation. But in 1862, when the first bill was done, this is also during the American Civil War, the early universities like Texas A&M that were part of the Confederate States, they had the money and the land that was ceded to them to be able to start the universities, but they didn't start them until after the war was over because, of course, they hoped it would come out differently. And when it didn't, they gladly took the money. But they also refused to allow Black, Native American, or even Asian or Hispanic students to attend. So the second bill of 1890 was actually to establish land-grant schools, particularly in the South, for African American students to attend. So even though, and you can go to the next slide, Amy. So Texas A&M is established by the state on April 17th, 1871, after the Morrill Act of 1862, and the first students are admitted and attend in 1876. The legislature establishes Prairie View as the Alta Vista Agriculture Mechanical College of Texas for Negro Youths. Try saying that at a rugby match. So they were established also in 1876. And they actually opened in 1878 to take on the first students. Because the Alta Vista Agricultural Mechanical College for Texas of Texas for Colored Youths was actually established on the Alta Vista plantation, there were buildings on the property already that were going to be converted and used for classroom space, dorm space, cafeteria, and the like. But there was a hurricane. I don't know why people are surprised by weather in Texas, but here we all are. So there's a hurricane, which also caused destruction at what is now Texas A&M. So they pushed back the opening of Prairie View's campus in order to allow for Texas A&M to rebuild their buildings so they could open first. I don't know why any of us would be surprised by that behavior, but here we all are again. So they opened, and their first students actually really started in late 76, early 77, and then Prairie View opened in early 1878. What this means is that these two campuses are really essentially born at the same time, and are in direct relationship with one another. They are part of the same system. They're both part of the Texas A&M University system, and as such, they operate under the same, for decades, really almost for a century. They operated with the same university president, and they still operate with the same board of regents. I think we go to the next slide now.
Okay. So I hope that gives you a little background. And I know the systems in the UK versus the United States are very different. And the land grant institutions are sort of their own in the way that public land grants work. Toniesha, do you have anything else, or should I go ahead and start the next bit?
No, I think you can go ahead and start the next bit. I'm actually
Okay.
going to, it looks like I might have internet back, so I'm going to switch
Okay.
computers too.
Great. I will keep talking then. We'll see you in a bit.
Go right ahead.
All right. We're reflecting on this because I think, like a lot of digital humanities projects, we had really big hopes for this, as we all do when we start these projects. But like all DH projects, sometimes you are taught both through success and sometimes through failure. Because what we ended up with, I think, was a lot more haphazard, less unified, and less sustainable than what we had initially hoped. And I think that teaches us some lessons. We're really good in DH about saying, a lot of times DH projects fail, but it's what we learn that sort of advances this new interdisciplinary field. So we want to sort of think through this over the next, 30 minutes or so, and use our experience to reflect on the pitfalls of this sort of work, particularly to individuals involved in it. Much of our reflection will center on institutional racism, as you can see, of the past, but also in the way such structural racism continues to impact the contemporary academic university. We'll talk particularly about preservation ownerships and the opportunities and detriments of such projects. And I think it's important that we understand, as we're moving forward, that what started as a very communal, collaborative project has sort of ended up back where we started, which is some siloed projects, some projects which are stalled at a standstill. So what I thought I would do is first give you a little background on the piece of the project that I've sort of inherited. It's sort of become my baby, which is the Millican Massacre project. And this is the front page of our current archival website. I want to point out that it says riot in quotes in the way we academics like to sort of call into question through our, quotes. I've been working with a community group, and they looked at this and they said, really, you can get rid of the cutesy little quotes, just call it the massacre, because that's what it was. So we're in the process, as we're working on a relaunch of the website. We're going to move it to the Millican Massacre. So you'll see some ambiguity as I work through the talk in terms of the name. The Millican Massacre 1868 archive collects materials related to the massacre that occurred in Millican, Texas, which is a small town, almost extinct town, located 15 miles from Texas A&M University. A massacre that may well have been the largest so-called race riot in Texas during Reconstruction. But it is virtually unknown and certainly not discussed in either historical circles or the larger public. This series of events during the summer of 1868 exploded on July 15th through 17th and led to white violence designed to control and contain Black civil rights, with a particular goal of ending Black voting and removing Pastor George Brooks, who was the de facto leader of the freedmen and women. As Henry E. McCulloch, Texas Revolutionary War soldier, Confederate Brigadier General, Texas Ranger, and Texas politician, stated in response to the Millican Massacre, quote, I will take occasion to say in conclusion that white men established and have maintained this government, that it is a white man's country, which is entitled to and must have a white man's government under the control of white voters and officers elected by them, and that I am utterly opposed to Negro suffrage in any form, as it must lead ultimately to Negro equality, to which I will never quietly submit. The massacre ended in the deaths of 5 to 150 Black citizens. We are not sure from historical records what the number is. And it included a brutal murder of Pastor George Brooks. When we wrote our paper, Pedagogies of Race, Digital Humanities in the Age of Ferguson in 2016, this project was launched on an Omeka website with a small number of supporting materials. Since then, a good bit of my work on the project has been outreach. I've given numerous talks to local community and campus groups, including a talk at the Gregory School in Houston, the African American Library in the Houston Public Library System, which is now housed in the formerly segregated school built in the first half of the 20th century in what was known as Freemanstown. We've worked with local community groups documenting Black history. We've invited them to Texas A&M to learn about our special collections materials that might aid their work, effectively puncturing the firewall between university and community. Most recently, I was contacted by the athletic department here at Texas A&M to brief them on Millican, and more on that later. The athletic director and director of football player development, associate diversity officer, learned of the massacre during a visit to the Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which honors enslaved peoples and those who were subjected to racial terror campaigns, including those who were lynched. I've worked with descendants of those involved in the Millican events, searching out historical traces of Black ancestors, a very difficult task given that the way that enslaved persons were documented. But my knowledge of materials from Brazos and Washington County at the end of the Civil War has helped me to locate invaluable information that I've been able to pass along to the descendants of the Millican folks. Toniesha and I have also worked extensively with a local community group to help develop a successful application for a Texas historical marker documenting the massacre. And that was really important to us. We wanted to start thinking of all the different ways we could bring public attention to what we see as a crucial moment in Texas Black history and Black and white history, both. This sort of public humanities work is why I continue to work with the Millican Project. Public digital humanities has been gaining credibility in the field, with much of our discussion focused on collaborative educational ventures. We'll be discussing how such work might bring power imbalances to the fore and how we might, as digital humanities practitioners, respond ethically to such moments. I've also been doing a good bit of back-end work on this Millican website. We've expanded the limited items on the site dramatically. I've been working with both graduate students and undergraduate students with this. There are more and more materials coming to light, especially in international presses. For example, it was covered extensively in the London papers, surprisingly. We've also been reworking the metadata to make it more equitable and more aware of the sort of nuances of this massacre. And we should be relaunching the site at the end of the year. After that, our next step of the project is to bring descendant stories into conversation with the historical materials, because as you would imagine, most of the historical materials are written by the white supremacists who were in charge of the time period. And the descendant stories offer valuable counter stories that flesh out information from Millican. Now I'm going to go to Toniesha.
There we go. All right. So like Amy, the project that I started with here is the Prairie View Women's Oral History Project. So she and I worked on the Millican project together that came out of the White Violence, Black Resistance project that we started. And along with that, I wanted to do the Prairie View Women's Oral History Project. So at the time, the university was 135, 4 years old, something like that, and was looking to start prepping for its 150th anniversary, which will actually be not far off actually, in a few years. And so what we did is started with this oral history project to collect the oral history narratives of women that have worked, gone to school, and helped to support the university over the years. So we started with 7 women, and my students collected artifacts, ephemera, they collected audio and video interviews, and I used this project in order to teach a variety of things actually. So I collaborated with another professor who was teaching production, and she helped students work through their audio video production. And we talked about what kind of research goes into creating documentary film work. And then I taught research methods, interviewing, content analysis, discourse analysis, and other rhetorical analysis, and then also the digital humanities methods as well. In the end, we have over 100 hours of audio and video interviews, thousands of artifacts and ephemera that have actually been gifted to the university in special collections and archive, and then also that have been reorganized under the idea of the Women's Oral History Project, which is fascinating. One of the things I'll say just quickly is that Prairie View, unlike other universities of its age and its era, did not have a prohibition against taking women students. So according to the historical record, the first woman to attend Prairie View as a student actually attended the very next year after it opened. And so, which in comparison to A&M is very, 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 very early. And so along with that, Prairie View also did not have a women's degree. A lot of universities had a degree for men and a degree for women. So you got a Bachelor of Science in mathematics, for example, if you were a man. If you were a woman, you got a Bachelor of Art in mathematics. So it had less math and more music or classics. And so, but not more philosophy, interestingly enough. Prairie View didn't do that. They offered one degree to everyone. So if you earned a mathematics degree at Prairie View, you earned the same degree whether you were a man or a woman. And so the university didn't really celebrate its women because it didn't see the difference really. And this project allowed them allowed us to start to think about what are the particular contributions that women have made to this campus, and then also to the greater Houston area, to Texas, and to the country and the world overall. So we were able to create dedicated digital and archival collections in both private and public collections. And now the university does an annual display that is curated through the library and archive. Actually, now in the month of March during Women's History Month is when they typically do that work. And next slide.
All right, let me bump back one here. My slides will behave. They never.
Pesky little slides.
Yeah, they are pesky. Let's go back one there. There we are. All right. So I thought what we would do is sort of talk about some of the key issues that we've learned as we went through this project. It kind of gives you a sense of how the two pieces were sort of both connected but moving forward at the same time. I would say one of the major issues that we discovered through our project was ideas of ownership. And we learned that ownership was, of course, not surprisingly impacted by these racially charged histories at our institutions. Here's what we wrote in our original essay. For instance, Taylor discovered that the two universities have had different attitudes toward the development of special collections materials. Certain types of preservation were viewed as a drain on limited resources that exacerbated existing power differentials. According to an informant, the racial tensions and pressures of creating a space, quote, for the education of Negroes meant that keeping paper and stuff was seen as the white man's job. You know, something that white folks did and could do better. You had folks that really believed that. So they thought that if they, A&M wanted to keep stuff, then folks would let them. Never mind that this meant they could care less about us or what really happens up there. But, we kept what we could when folks would know better. Which when Toniesha told me that story, I was both floored, but not surprised. Taylor discovered during her time working on the Prairie View women's materials that many Prairie View A&M related materials had been moved to Texas A&M special collections over the years. Yet the materials were often stored haphazardly in back rooms at the main campus, effectively hidden from the cataloging system and therefore from use. Through our collaborations, we have been able to find partners at both institutions to help review the collections. The Dean of TAMU Libraries has promised to return the materials pending the findings of the investigation. The process of repatriation has begun, which sounds really good. However, they did repatriate something. The Texas A&M Library did repatriate something. They decided to return digital copies of the Prairie View materials, but have steadfastly held onto the original physical materials. And that includes the diary of the first president of Prairie View, which I am still flabbergasted that we think we should hold here at the main campus. And of course, we talk about it as main campus, which in itself is a problem, right? This attitude reflects longstanding ideas of Black institutional archives. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this from a current book project. The long history of archival micro and macroaggressions, archival violences must be understood and considered as we digitize Black cultural materials. The very structures in which we locate the text, the library, or the archive are intertwined within the institutional histories in which Black texts are housed. William and Mary, for example, William and Mary College, for example, which this is the page from their discussion of slavery. William and Mary owned enslaved peoples and depended upon their labor to build and run the institution. As Jennifer Oates notes, slaves were as inseparable a part of the college as the old bricks of the college building itself. I thought of this very conundrum when I visited the University of Alabama library a number of years ago. My path to the library led me past Foster Auditorium, the location of George Wallace's speech in which he declared, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. From the auditorium, it was a short walk across the quad to the library where I, a white woman, would examine the Angela Davis ephemera collection in a room where all the librarians were white. I emphasize my positionality because we must remember Ashley Farmer's work about archiving while Black, of the weight of being the only person of color in the room, surrounded by images and artifacts of America's favorite colonizers, while waiting for the staff to bring out research materials. There is more than a disconnect between the segregated past and the current library archive. There is a racist echo that impacts the way we archive, the way we understand archives, and the way we bring cultural materials to digital forms, whether as surrogates or data. The structures in which we do digital humanities, in which we collect rare textual materials into archives, the structures that allow us to labor to build digital collections, archives, are all entwined with these histories that are inescapably bound with the potential recommodification of Black life, as Jessica Johnson and Vincent Brown, among other scholars, remind us in their work. As Rupika Rism suggests in What Passes for Human, for digital humanities, using these technologies raises a question of complicity with the reproduction and amplification of normative forms of human subjectivity, that these technologies reinforce the notion that there are normative and singular ways of being human in the 21st century. The removal of archival materials from Black colleges, universities, and libraries to predominantly white archives, as we've discovered, must figure in our work digitizing Black culture materials. Kim Gowan, who runs the Black Press Research Collective, writes of the acquisition of the Amsterdam News Photo Library by Cornell University, a historically white university. In short, the crux of the problem is that historically Black colleges and universities, libraries, and research centers, relative to their white counterparts, often lack the budgets necessary to first acquire Black press collections and second to digitize and maintain them. Thus, it is not a matter of lack of desire for these collections, but rather fiscal capability, which prevents Black institutions from acquiring them. On the other hand, elite and predominantly white institutions, while to be congratulated for recognizing the significance of Black history, are further enriched by the procurement of Black press collectives. Researchers' use and grants from organizations such as the National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize and preserve the archival materials enhance institutions already flush with wealth. Tamer Evangelista Doherty's retelling of a visit to the Huntington Library by a group of Black students who came to examine Octavia Butler's collection is illuminating. Upon seeing the collection, the students were shocked. "A Black collection doesn't belong in this place," one student whispered to me as we stood around a table displaying Butler materials thoughtfully arranged for us. "Why are her papers here?" another whispered. Both Gallen and Evangelista Doherty raise uncomfortable questions that we must face. Consider the daguerreotypes of enslaved peoples made for Luis Agassiz, the biologist who argued for biological racism, owned, and I put that in quote, by Harvard. You've seen these images. It is the very famous image of a man with his back turned to the camera, marked by the enslaver's whip. I'm deliberately choosing not to show that image. Instead, what I'm showing is an image of his descendants holding his image. And I think this is important that that image has been so exploited. And I want to center the families and their ownership of the image. Descendants of Renty and Dahlia, pictured in some of the images, are suing Harvard for the return of the images. Damages for the profits that Harvard has made on the images, such as licensing fees for use of the images, and asking Harvard to follow other steps to acknowledge the university's complicity in the exploitation of the men and women who appear in those images. Harvard has evolved from aggressively pursuing all copyright claims to asserting no copyright, but they continue to retain ownership of the images. The object that has been retained and reproduced is not just an object. Such images are, as Tanya Sutherland reminds us, still embodied. Remembering them in digital culture also includes aspect of embodiment. There is a societal idea of the, quote, Black body upon which narratives are projected and around which mythologies are formed. This separation of the Black body imagery from the lived experiences of Black people is dangerous, in that it makes possible an ideological severing of idea and corpus. This separation is even more pronounced in digital spaces, particularly when pain and other embodied experiences fail to connect the virtual image and the physical flesh, as this notion of the Black body as souvenir extends into the digital. I've written elsewhere on the danger of how digital humanists think of our data. We mine, we exploit, we blacklist. The way we talk about programming and data leads to bias within the works we do and often extends racist ideologies. Daniela Agostino connects this drive for data, the mining and exploitation we see in the possibilities of big data, as an extension of colonialist ideology. She writes, but this logic of quantification itself embedded in the archives can stand in the way of centering the present. Thinking about care in the colonial context highlights the instrumental political uses to which models of care, of course I'm going the wrong way, can stand in the way of centering the experience of the communities who lived under colonialism and slavery. Inheriting quantified data that was already instrumental in the dehumanization of subjects, such as computational methods, often run the risk of accentuating the violence of abstraction by datafied means. bodies once commodified by the archives return as raw materials and currency in a sort of digital afterlife. And I really kind of want to push on this. There's been really good work starting to come out about thinking about through post-colonial lenses, thinking about the idea of who gets to speak, how we're speaking, and how we reuse these kinds of images and information and turn them into data. And I think a lot of the discussion in response to this has centered on the idea of care work, and the idea of that if we think about how we have to engage with these materials under an ideology of care, we might be able to start to sort of unpack some of those very difficult and long-standing historical resonances which are coming out in the archives. And now I'm going to turn to Toniesha.
Okay, so I really love that Amy kind of already did sort of the literature and background, because this is something that was really important to the way that we sort of both have been thinking through this project, but specifically the way that sort of the background work that was happening in the attempts to have the physical reparation of work and collection back to Prairie View, particularly that is institutional history, but also even in the way that the digital repatriation occurred. One of the things that was important for me to teach my students and to really work with the university and talk through was this idea that ownership of the digital matters, and that the way that we tag it is really important. And so in teaching sort of research methods through digital space, it became really important to me to teach my students to really ask questions and think through how we not only create metadata, but how that metadata then creates sort of linguistic ownership over particular kinds of artifacts, right? And so the students learn to build their digital exhibits in that sort of critical space of thinking through, even if you're using something that has been repatriated back to the university, but is still listed as as owned by A&M, right? What are the ways that then we can really trace this true ownership back through to its original owner, which is still Prairie View, right? And so we talked a lot about how we would do that. Now, I had some students who openly said that they were just going to go rogue and go with the original owner. They were like, you only cite one person when you cite things. Which I really loved. I did have a student who went back to the Chicago Manual of Style and found that which is what I was teaching them to use at the time, and found where the Chicago Manual of Style says if you're going to quote something, you quote the original author if you read the original author. And my students were like, well, but we read the original thing, and the original thing was in a newspaper from Prairie View. It just got stolen. It's like, you don't cite the thief, which I really loved about them. I thought that was delicious. And I 100% supported it, even though, and we'll talk a little bit later about the naive things you do pre-tenure. And so there were definitely risks to doing this. But for my students, it was important to me that they learned to be able to do these things. And so, because I also see our work going back to the original mission of the land grant institution is to teach students and professionalize them into spaces that they can walk straight out of the institution into career paths. And one of the things that you can do as an undergrad, coming straight out of an undergraduate program, is go straight into working for Cultural Archive as the digital scribe. And I wanted my students to, if they were going to look at those types of positions, or what most of them would likely look at are positions where they would be creating websites or videos or audio podcasts for cultural sort of cultural areas like museums or universities or other sorts of sort of I guess cultural works locations where they would be able to think critically and even push back on ownership claims that institutions might make, right? And so when they were creating those sort of new works, they would be able to do that in a space where they understood what was important about metadata and ownership. So this project is one that continued for a number of years while I was at Prairie View, but it actually ended before I left. And so we can go to the next slide. In talking about ownership, we also can talk about intentional sunsets. So the Prairie View Women's Oral History Project, which I'll talk a little bit more about in my next slide about roadblocks and funding. But this project I allowed to intentionally sunset. Uh, the university was really, really thrilled to support this project in terms of talking about it, but they weren't necessarily jumping up and down about funding it. They weren't necessarily jumping up and down about recognizing my students' work on it, or even my work on it as a scholar until they started to see the numbers, right? And so the president of the university would often share the project, and he went to share it one day while actually I was in the UK giving a talk about a different digital project, and called me in a panic because the link didn't work. And I said to him, you know, very harshly and probably shouldn't have given the fact that I don't think I quite had tenure yet. Um, but I said, listen, when you pay for it, you can use it. And that was it. And I hung up. Again, we'll talk about the risks later. But I let this project sunset because the university didn't want to pay for it. Um, they do still own, though, because it still is very important to me that when parts of this project are out in the world, that they're understood as owned by the university. They still own everything that was cited and collected there. And one day when they decide to pay for it again, it'll be stood up again.
Okay, I think we have about 10, 12 minutes left, so we'll move toward our end here. I want to briefly talk about the dangers and opportunities of this kind of work, which Toniesha nicely alluded to. When we started this project, we were both untenured and probably fairly naive. And I guess the thing that I would like to say, there are great opportunities with this project, just the kinds of work and community building and change and student impact we've had. Right there, huge opportunities. And it's also been really helpful to us as scholars to do this work. We're here talking to you. Toniesha got to have a big presentation at South by Southwest, which I'm still jealous of, and I think that's very cool. But there's real dangers, and I wanted to just briefly point to them as you're thinking through like what the opportunities are and what the risk is to you. I think the most important thing we learned is to know your institutional structures. Toniesha's were very different than mine, even though we sit under the same board of regents. The way they viewed the kinds of work we were doing and the kinds of visibility that we gained through these projects, they were viewed very differently. And I think that Toniesha's university saw her as taking a much greater risk than what mine did. I sort of am one of many. She really sort of stood out among her institutional structure. And we're not suggesting that this work shouldn't be done, but what we're suggesting is that it's helpful to know what you're going into and to really sort of think through who your allies are and how those allies can support you through the process, because we know in the universities, at least in the United States, that there's a real danger, particularly to women faculty of color who do this work. Lorgia Garcia's Pena's tenure denial most recently. She's a star in Afro-Caribbean work. I mean, absolute star, and she's denied tenure. So, there's a long history of this, and one must be careful. On the flip side of that, I think we both believe that those people who take chances pre-tenure are probably the ones going to take chances post-tenure. It's hard to go from saying nothing to saying everything. And I know Toniesha will talk more about this, but I want to briefly mention that as a white scholar working in the field of Black studies, now that I'm post-tenure, I feel particular responsibility. And that means it's not a responsibility in a paternalistic way or to speak for someone way, but it's to sort of be a shield, right? To throw my body in front of someone else so they can say what they need to say. And I thought a lot about this when I was the chair of a DH panel in Krakow, and everyone on the panel were untenured women of color from all around the world. And they were pretty severely attacked by white male participants at the conference. And it really made me think, like, I have a moment, here's what I must say. And, my job was to shut them down and to protect the people in the panel, not in a paternalistic way, but in a way to allow them to speak and not to speak for them. All right, Toniesha?
So along with that, there are roadblocks, there's funding, there's technology. You guys are in a really awesome position because you're graduate students. So the world still looks very, very rosy. And it did to me and Amy too at one point. And probably still does in some ways because we're both kind of optimistic. Um, but we're also realists. So when we talk about roadblocks, I have their department, college, university, oh my. And I cannot echo enough what Amy just said about knowing the system that you're in. Whether you're at a land grant institution, you're at an HBCU, you're at a PWI, you're in a region where things are politically more conservative. All of those things matter when we're talking about what kinds of roadblocks might be there. The way to be able to navigate this is talk to people. Research is so much more fun with friends. Dr. Rebecca Frost actually talks a lot about that in her DH presentations and her DH research, and it truly is. And you need to make friends in your department, in your college, in your university. Now, that does not mean that you need to be friends. I always say like tea and crumpet friends, which I'm sure takes on a different meaning in UK context, but you don't have to be that close with people, right? But you do need to be like colleagues where you can go and have a nice professional conversation, and be able to find out what are the things that can work or not work. And also know that the things that were roadblocks for someone else may or may not be roadblocks for you. Like Amy alluded to, for at A&M, Amy has the benefit of an entire research center with all kinds of other faculty and practically a dean. And at Prairie View at the time, I did not have that institutional protection in order to kind of find a home for the work, right? But because my degrees are all in communication, and communication already has a technological side as a discipline, the work and the digital work that I was doing moving into digital humanities already had sort of a place where people understood it, right? They just put it in media. And so that, if you're in that kind of space, that made it a little bit easier, even though I didn't have a lot of those institutional sorts of things that could have actually really helped out. So that takes me into funding and technology as we wrap up. So funding, yes, you need it. Yay, we don't have any sort of. So like I said, I allowed a project to intentionally sunset at the same time that I was actually partnering to join a Mellon funded digital humanities grant. that was going to give seed money to scholars on my campus and 3 other campuses to fund their DH projects. Now, I could have really spent a little bit more time chasing down internal and external funding to keep the Prairie View Women's Oral History Project standing. But along with roadblocks, I think you also need to think about what are the fights you can win, right? And one of the fights that I knew I couldn't win if the institution wasn't honestly going to support it was the fight to keep that project standing, right? Along with the fact that I'm also just the right kind of petty um, to say, if y'all say you want this project and you want to stand this project up, and I've written 4 different budgets that tell you what the technology needs are, what the funding needs are, and what the institutional infrastructure needs are, and you keep saying you want to fund it, but you keep not funding it, I'm not going to spend my personal research dollars to do this, right? And so I let them make that argument, let them figure that out for themselves, um, and gave them the raw materials to do so. In terms of technology, sometimes if you're at an institution that doesn't have a digital humanities research center or a media research center, you may need to talk to your administrators at the department, college, and university level, like they're 3rd graders from the 1980s, and it's okay. um, or I feel like the age grading in the UK is a little bit different. So like primary school, like I don't know what you are when you're like 3rd graders are like 11. So whatever that is. But sometimes you just have to kind of break it down for folks so that they understand what it is that you need. Um, a lot of times I think for digital humanities work, and this is where it was a little bit easier being a comm person, is I know that people often look at television productions or movies, or even just a news interview, and they think that it takes no time at all, and whatever the actual runtime is of the thing is how long it took to produce. And they don't realize that, for example, a feature-length film that takes 90 minutes to watch took 2.5 years to make. And so a lot of times explaining your technological needs and your infrastructure needs is going to take time. And you kind of have to break it down like you're talking to small children.
I think we're almost out of time, so I want to leave us with sort of a thought to launch us into discussion, and then let Toniesha do the same. I want to wrap up with this sort of moment of truth and reconciliation, which I think is really important, not only in the US, but worldwide. I know you in the UK have had similar discussions. We're really having to come to terms with the racist and white supremacist histories of academics, of institutions, right? So like, for example, at Georgetown University is having to come to terms with that 272 enslaved persons were sold to prop the institution up at the very beginning of its lifespan. And they've started to think about ways to document that and to offer restitution, which is pretty common. At my institution, I'm showing you an image from one of our yearbooks. In 1906, we had people actually in Klan regalia in the yearbooks. They're so proud of this. They not only have the KKKs, but they list their individual names. I don't know what the point of a hood is if you're going to list your names, but there they are. We own Klan robes that our proud university alumni have donated. For example, this robe you're looking at with the inscription has the name of our most famous and winningest football coach. How do we deal with that? What does that mean when this summer we had a lot of protests post George Floyd, Black Lives Matters, but also to remove the Confederate statue of our very first president? And most of them were led by Black athletes. What does this mean, right? When you think about the fact that we celebrate the Klan robe of our winningest football coach. There's lots of examples out there. We can talk more about them in Q&A. One of the best I've seen has come from William and Mary, at least in terms of engagement with students. They have a summer program, they have classroom outreach, they have this particular fellowship, which allows individual students to do deep digs on these white supremacist histories of their universities to bring them public and have the discussions we need to have regarding how we move forward. Because we're at a moment where they're bubbling up, where whether we want to or not, we're going to have to deal with this. And we've seen, at least in the US, what happens when we sort of say, Obama's elected, it's post-race, let's move along. And then we have Trump. So I think this is a important moment, and the kinds of work that Toniesha and I have taken on really engages with this. Toniesha, you want to wrap up?
Yeah, I'll just wrap up to say that in terms of truth and reconciliation, one of the things that's really important is institutional buy-in and responsibility. And just because your institution is either young or is established by or for the education of Black or Indigenous or whatever other non-white population occurs in your community, does not necessarily mean that they too don't also have a responsibility in truth and reconciliation. A lot of times it might mean that we have more of a responsibility to participate in those conversations and need to look just as closely at the ways that our institutions have been created to support or prop up white supremacist ideologies, right? And so thinking about institutional buy-in is also, and responsibility is also about thinking about what is your individual institutional buy-in and responsibility, right? Institutions don't exist without people. And so, it's important to be able to ask ourselves questions about what it is that we are really supporting and what do we want to continue to support and what do we want to change.
Do we want to stop there, Toniesha?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop.
Okay, because we want to make sure we have conversations. So we will
Yeah.
end there and open the floor. Lily?
Hello again. This was really lovely. Thank you. I just want to invite anyone from the audience who would want to join us with their cameras. Please do feel free to do that. I realize we left you there kind of like alone, and it's always really weird with the Zooms. So yeah. We also do have obviously the option to turn microphones on, but I think it would still make sense if people would just raise their hand if they had an idea or a question. I think maybe I can make a start. You said a lot of things that I think I have not really thought about. Of course, I have looked into your work before, so I am aware of what you do. But for example, this question of language, like mining, extraction, exploitation, I haven't really thought about the ways that language operates in this way, and the fact that this kind of goes beyond your own particular field, I guess. And I did want to ask you about, kind of like take a step back and just ask you about digital humanities, because I guess with this series, we kind of also wanted to think about what digital sort of means. So I think, even though I really want to talk about the sociopolitical element of your work, I just kind of wanted to start there because I think it is a good place for this seminar. Yeah.
Absolutely. Toniesha, do you want to start? We
Yeah,
were actually talking about this as we prepared.
We were. So there's so much, right? Because we could talk about like the difference between born digital projects and projects that become digital, right? And so I always think of born digital projects as projects related to the kinds of things that I do on social media, right? Where all of that is digitally based. There is no text, right? Which means I'm 100% dependent on either some kind of scraping, somebody else's server, somebody else's whatever, which I gave an interview to a press outlet here about Parler, sort of whenever that was happening, which I think is an excellent example, right, of of a space where, again, ownership of the digital is important, right? Because they didn't actually own any of the servers that hosted their website. So when the communities kind of stood up and said, okay, you know what? That's enough of that white supremacist nonsense. um, and the companies shut them down. They literally disappeared off the face of the earth, right? Now that doesn't mean white supremacy disappeared off the face of the earth with them, right? As Amy pointed out, you know, you can still go to Texas A&M and see a Klan robe, and that's fun, isn't it? Um, and so when we think about sort of these projects and the language, it is also about how we're going to talk about it, but also what do you do to do you use the words that people used, right? Do you just leave it? Do you put it in quotes? Because for example, with the Millican work that we did, you know, if we just put up the articles, every article called it a riot, right? But they also blamed all the Black people, right? But then when you read through from the Black press coverage at the time, and even from the liberal white press coverage at the time, you're like, okay, wait a second, right? These Black people were minding their business trying to vote and go to church. Like they weren't trying to do anything special. Like they were just trying to breathe and go to church. Like that was summer afternoon. Um, and get paid for their labor, right? That's all that they wanted. They didn't want anything else. And the white community around them didn't want them to have that. And so, you know, what does it mean to kind of look through the archive and understand what that means and be able to contextualize that both in its contemporary moment and this contemporary moment, right? And so I feel like I might not have answered all of that question, but that's I think what we need to think about in terms of how this happens.
And I guess I'll pick up on it from the opposite direction. So you sort of get this is why I love working with Toniesha. We sort of think and come together in the middle. It's really fun. So the other thing we were talking about as we were preparing too, that sort of points to your question, is that, you know, when I started digital humanities way back when, before we called it digital humanities, you know, I saw it as this sort of maybe discipline that was on the peripheral of sort of traditional fields. So certainly when I came up for tenure, one of the issues was the English department kind of looked at me and went, what is this stuff? I mean, people sort of said two things. They said, one, you do race, we don't know what that is. And two, what's this digital humanities stuff? Is that really scholarship? We've come a long way since then, I will say, but it felt like I was on the outside by doing digital humanities. But what I've since seen as we're starting to discuss these sort of cultural studies, critical race studies ideas, is in some ways, Martha Nell Smith said this early on, and she's absolutely right. Digital humanities in the sort of form of digital humanities in linguistics, in how it's practiced in the German Academy, for example, very sort of text-based, very sort of old school computational linguistics. It really was a place where people who were nervous about all this sort of, oh my God, queer theory, race, gender, they all sort of ran at a certain moment, it seems to me, early on into the digital humanities. And what we're seeing now, I think, is that as there's more and more work that crosses over from other fields into digital humanities, where people like Toniesha and I are saying, we are digital humanists who do critical race studies, post-colonial DH, queer theory DH, people looking sort of more broadly at DH than the sort of traditional way it was originally sort of conceptualized. There's a lot of tension between those two camps. Most recently, for those of you who followed the humanist blow up, the humanist listserv was affiliated with ADHO, which is one of the sort of organizations that sit under the larger DH rubric. The humanist was supposed to be a listserv that served that community. There was a moment within the last year where the person who monitored it, who's a UK professor, allowed a post that went out that talked about anti-white racism, with all the problems with that, as you can imagine. Bad enough he let that post go out, but then he stopped any discussion of the post. And many of us wrote back and we were like, there is no such thing as anti-white racism. Why, here's all the reasons we believe that's not true. This is not the way to have this discussion. We don't know what you're saying. That whole discourse was shut down in Humanist. And what it did was, again, sever sort of one component. The Humanist listserv basically unattached itself from a digital humanities group and sort of went off on its own and is now running itself as a separate thing. And it represents that sort of what I think is really interesting DH, which is dealing with all these cultural isms, the kind of work Toniesha and I do, versus a very old model of DH. And that's further separating. And of interest to you all in the UK, I would say there also feels like, to me, at least in the US, is we're getting this sort of hemispheric division of the field, where there's sort of the Americas, North and South Americas, global South, which is conceptualizing itself in one way. And then there's a very conservative European academy, which is going another way. And digital humanities, largely writ, the conference has been a site a lot of that tension, the panel I mentioned.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess it kind of makes a lot of sense what you've just said, and Toniesha earlier as well. Also, because kind of thinking about what digital humanities means to me, I think what it is the sort of, the addition of the humanities makes it sort of like more specific. But in general, I feel like there's loads of different people within that umbrella, and there's loads of people who are just sort of like super excited about all these technological possibilities. But actually, the reality of it is, when I discovered your article, I wasn't surprised that there's two women writing about grassroots activist approaches. And I think that sadly, it feels like that's still kind of like the case. And I wonder how you feel sort of like, producing this kind of work. And I guess that, for you, you're involved with lots of different communities. So there's probably a lot of positive stuff that comes with that. But I wonder whether you ever feel like it's not really, this like moment where it's supposed to sort of like kick off, or it's supposed to do what it's supposed to be doing kind of thing isn't really happening. Whether you're ever sort of thinking, to kind of like not bother with it, I guess.
Oh yeah. Oh, definitely. I think that's why you though have to do research with friends, right? Otherwise you drink way too much bourbon or way too much gin or way too much beer. Because it feels like you're not going anywhere sometimes. And I think that, Amy and I have talked about over the years about how, and I think in the future, we should probably have another longer conversation, I think, about kind of the risk reward. You know, Amy and I came into this field from different directions. She came from English, I came from communication, but we also came into this field at a time when it was already exploding and growing. I think in another, for the folks who do intellectual history, they'll probably go back and look at like the 2000 to 2020 space and be like, that 20 years of explosive growth meant this things, right? And I absolutely will not label what this moment is, because I think that's, for another scholar in probably 20 years time. But what I will say is, I think what it means now is that you can have a lot more collaboration, that there's a lot more, I think oddly, the pandemic has sped along international collaborations in particular ways, because we're all working from home, we're having this moment, right? But it's also meant that we've really had the opportunity and the need to really have conversations about how do you evaluate this work for graduate students? How do you evaluate this work for someone's dissertation or for tenure and promotion or for movement from associate to full in the way that the US does tenure and promotion. And what it has also meant is having those sort of institutional conversations around sort of what are the definitive edges, if you will. And I can say that I think there was something Amy had mentioned during the presentation about, and something she and I both agree on, that, if you didn't open your mouth and say anything when you were a graduate student, you're not going to do it when you're an assistant professor. You're not going to suddenly become mouthy um, as a tenured professor. It's not going to happen. And please don't believe that it will. But it means that for those of us who are on that side, right? So for me and Amy, I'm also a department chair. And so for me, in a department that's got a graduate program. So it also means being able to mentor and guide my graduate students through this kind of work, and being honest about what it will mean for other institutions. We love it at Texas Southern, right? And we support it there. But if you're going to another institution, being honest about the fact that they may or may not support it in the same kind of way, and that it's important to kind of think through that. And I know, Amy, you've had those conversations with your graduate students because you guys have PhD students.
Yeah. What's really interesting to me is, we were talking about, Lily and I were talking about this earlier as we were getting started. In some ways, this idea of linear progression seems to have been, which we know is sort of a mythology anyway. Right. But at this moment, it's very clear that a lot of things are circular, right? Like, especially in the US, it feels like we're just spinning round and round again around the issues of race as the sort of key foundational sin of the country, which we can't move beyond. But I do think in terms of digital humanities, what's interesting is that while it has a lot of opportunities, I don't believe that I would have a tenured position at a Research One institution had I been doing a more traditional field, because the field was so full, it was hard to break in. The fact that I went this circuitous way and was doing work that no one else in my institution could do made a real difference. So there's definitely opportunities there. And we talked to our PhD students about different ways they can compose their CV, because you may not end up with a tenure line position. They're almost gone, right? Like Toniesha and I are just the rarity. At the same time, we also know that when we're looking at structures of academia, it's one of the most conservative institutions, no matter what the conservative politicians scream in the US. We are one of the most conservative institutions, at least in how we function. I remember at a DH meeting a number of years ago, Melissa Taras, who's a DHer from the UK, put up a chart of women in faculty positions in the UK, and the numbers of women who were the equivalent of a full professor in the UK, my jaw dropped. We knew we're bad in the US, but from her numbers, I said, you might actually have worse representational problems than we do. So these historical structures we still see within academic institutions are exactly the kinds of things that, as a digital humanist who are looking at these sort of critical code studies or power structures built into the kinds of materials we're doing, that we're forced to do as we bring things from print to digital, that can be very useful in interrogating the institutional structures we work in. And I think we're really needed now at a moment where academia is changing so rapidly. So I see it as a really important moment, but on a moment where we must continue to use our voices, even when it's uncomfortable.
Thank you. Yes, I hope you will keep going. I am aware that we have a lot of different people have joined us actually, and a few of them I'm not aware whether they are students or not, but I know we have David Young, who is actually in our department, media. So I wonder whether, maybe he had something to say, but also I would just like to invite everyone. I think we have Yasmin. If you want to just, join us with your camera and microphone.
Yeah, sorry, I can't turn my camera on, but
okay.
I just wanted to say, I remember meeting Amy in Shanghai some years ago.
Oh, yes, wonderful. Hello again. Wonderful.
I just wanted to say that your observations about digital humanities being different in the UK and the US is very true. And one of the things we are having at the moment is computational scientists entering it and sort of giving it a lot of technicity. And the movement in which we are reinterrogating the notions of race and space in America is actually quite exciting. Whether that's going to happen with the kind of emphasis we are putting into UK, I don't know. I think I've got my doubts on that, because there has been a sort of a dominant male gaze into DH as well. So the kind of work you both are doing is inspiring. But what I wanted to ask is, where would you put the emphasis on the digital or the humanities in recurating history? And in terms of repressing new ways to look at these archives, but also this idea of the shadow archives that form, and how can we make the relationship in terms of the different kinds of massacres that have happened in the US in terms of white supremacy? And so when we concentrate on events as the building of these shadow archives, do we then foreclose the connectivity in terms of the wider historicity or not?
Those are great questions. No, those are wonderful questions. Thank you. Thank you. No. I think you raise really good points. This is the same issue, it seems to me, that Toniesha and I have been talking about in terms of nation states, right? Like how those sort of lenses that we're putting on things are foreclosing other discussions we need to have. And I think you're right in that if you focus on these individual events, what has happened historically is they're easy to push aside and erase, right? Like, you know, we don't see the weight of the multiple massacres because they've really been erased from historical focus. So there is indeed a danger of focusing too closely on this one event or this one location. It would be very easy, and this is what I liked about what Toniesha said, it would be very easy to say the site of racism in the Texas A&M University system is the Texas A&M University, the place which didn't let women in until almost the 70s, certainly did not let any people of color in until they were forced to in the mid 60s. But I think what Toniesha points to very rightly is how these other institutional structures could be complicit in this. And so the challenge of working with this material is really to leave those multiplicities open. And you know, the project I'm working on right now is really trying to engage with this. I'm taking some very basic DH tools like the database and saying, we have this structure that we work with. A database is a common form for digital humanities. It is a structure that precludes ambiguity. If I am encoding a human being in terms of racial identity, which is a fluid category, as we know historically, but putting it into a database that hardens, binarizes this kind of idea, where do we go from here? So those are the questions where I think when you ask, when is the digital separate from the human, where do we put, you know, is the tech separate from the humanities piece? I think we're at a moment where we need people who can put them in context. And I think this is what I always tell the social scientists and the folks who are doing sort of more hardcore computational work. You can't forget the human. You need us because you will make mistakes. And one of the things I always tell my students is the biggest mistake that the TEI XML made in its conceptualization when it first started to figure out what kind of schema I wanted to use. And this was brought up by, again, Melissa Taras a number of years ago. Initially, the encoding for woman and man, actually, I think it was man and woman, men were encoded as 1, women were encoded as 2. So women were literally encoded as the second sex. That is why you need the humanities and cultural studies, because without that, you know, we're just reproducing those systems. And I don't know if I really addressed your question, but I'll let Toniesha take over now.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the TEI did so many things in encoding that are weird, gender, race. But again, another conversation for a different day. I think sort of, if I may call you Yasmin,
Of course.
addressing your question, I think that one of the things that I always think about is that for me, the digital and the human are always together. And it's sort of, it's kind of, I see it for me the same way as seeing myself as a Black woman. I don't separate them, right? That's just a sort of a singular concept, and the digital humanities to me functions in the same way as a singular concept. I 100% owe that though to the fact that as a communication scholar, I was trained as a rhetorician, but I was also trained to study rhetoric through mediated lenses. And so I was trained to study speeches through audio representation of that speech. And so to understand that that is media, it is analog or it is digital. And so, but because it's a media, it's always technologically produced. And so for me, the digital humanities functions in that same way, right? That is always technologically produced. And so it's really more about how do you understand both the possibilities and the limits of that technological production? And also, is it a production or is it a reproduction? And so that's usually where I kind of separate those things, is if we're talking about something that's a reproduction, so it wasn't originally produced to be captured through technological means, or is it something that was originally produced to be captured through technological means? So I think of, for example, like a stage play. A stage play is a very humanistic production. It has lots of technological things that are part of it, lighting, sound, right? But it's not produced to be consumed in its primary consumption as a mediated image, right? It's produced in its primary consumption to be something that happens live for the people in the room. So technology enhances the production, but it's not required for the production, if that makes sense. And so, so for me, I always look at digital humanities is kind of the way that it splits is this research that is enhanced by the digital production, or is the digital production required in order to make it happen? And for some things it is, and some things it isn't. And so that it's always kind of about knowing it as both a tool and a method, I guess.
Thank you. I mean, I just wanted to say that technology and the remediation of form through technology, coding itself is a remediation because it's, it comes as a mediated form of communication, infrastructure, what have you. And that can either be effacement on the one hand, or it can be a regeneration, or can be generative in terms of reigniting what you are trying to do, in terms of understanding what has been erased or repurposed for white supremacy. So I think it's, wildly exciting. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And I see a comment
Thank
in
you.
the chat.
Yeah.
Do you want to read it, Lily?
Yes, so we have a question from Lucy. I also realize it's sort of like dinner time for a lot of people. So
Yeah.
we are recording them.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping we can make this available. Lucia says, hi, thanks so much. This is all so interesting. For a lot of early career scholars in the UK, it can be very tricky to engage in with institutional structures and the history of their own institution, because most scholars have temporary contracts and have to constantly move from one institution to another. To what extent do you feel your own institutions support and welcome self-reflective projects?
Such a good question.
Such a great question.
And probably becoming pretty relevant in the US too, because there's so few tenure line. I mean, we're talking about a lot of assistant professorships not having tenure, but so few of us now are entering any kind of tenure line, and sort of will go through an entire career in a non-tenure line position, which has depending on the institution, more or less security. One thing I sort of wanted to mention that I didn't get to talk about in the talk was my institution. I think it's pretty clear they did not remove, after all the protests we had this summer, they refused to remove the statue of our first president, the man who was known as a, quote, Indian massacre, who was known for reinforcing white supremacy. His writings are pretty clear on it. They just wouldn't remove it. And it became an issue that moved beyond the university and went to the state apparatus. And they basically said, you will not remove him. So there was no will to fix that issue, to even begin engaging with it. I think they just wanted it to go away. So it seems to me pretty clearly that that conversation, as much as I want to have it, there's resistances. But as usual, there's often ways to get around the system. And I've been at Texas A&M long enough to know that there's not a lot of power in most faculty. Where the power remains are certain institutions such as the football program. I'm sure you in the UK are surprised to learn this. But when I was contacted by the athletics program, I thought, here is a possibility. And what they have done, because their student athletes were so angered by the lack of removal of the statue, is it's clear they have to address that. And there's been a student institution begun out of the Black student athletes. And I was reading their webpage, and it is by far the most radical webpage of any I've seen at Texas A&M. I mean, they're forthrightly talking about restitution. They're talking about issues of social justice in ways that are much more forthright than many of us can be. So what I've decided is I've begun to work with them, because I think if there's change, the football program, strangely enough, has power to make it happen. Because if there's one thing that former students and alumni want, is their football team to win. And if that means having to address some of these issues to keep players recruited, they will do it. And that's sort of a sick and twisted way to go about it. But again, here's where I think you have to work through whatever institutional structures you have. And I believe that that particular group is working in good faith and wants this to occur. So that's my sort of roundabout way that sometimes you have to be a little sneaky and protect yourself in the process. I think it's important to not sort of do things that will leave you vulnerable. We've seen that over and over again at US institutions of what can happen.
We have, I don't know if Toniesha, you want to respond to that, but we do have.
No, I think we can go to the other question. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Yes, there we go.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And as an LSU alumni, I am amazed to hear that the football team is helping with Texas A&M. That is just really wild. I wanted to ask about, and Dr. Taylor, you touched upon this a bit, the kind of cross institutional collaboration and how it's been even more brought forward with COVID, how it's become international. Can you talk a little bit more about these networks that are being created thanks to the digital, the nature, this intangible nature of the digital humanities? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are so many ways. Some of it is just the just friendships, right? I actually I will say for Amy and I, it started because I ran up to A&M for the launch of their Digital Humanities Center. And then I saw Amy and she seemed friendly. So I was like, let me talk to her. And so I was actually able to start some of my institutional connections, because at the time also Texas A&M was trying to keep from getting sued, quite frankly. And so they were starting, actually now that I think about it, LSU was doing the same thing at the time with Southern. And so, yeah, man, listen, 2012. And so what was happening for a lot of places is they realizing that they had these like massive issues, right, that were sort of holdovers from the past. And so Texas A&M and Prairie View had this, or well, really it was Texas A&M, the system and the university had decided that what they probably needed to do was do more faculty seed grants, but not give the money to A&M faculty, but to give the money to Prairie View faculty. But then they realized that they couldn't get A&M faculty to work with Prairie View faculty unless they gave A&M faculty money too. And so like, and I don't know why that was a thing they realized, but it was something that they did in order to sort of foster collaboration. And so, so we used that as one way to kind of get started. And then we also used, well, I also used some other opportunities to be able to partner with their institutions. So I used some grant money through the Mellon Foundation as well, to be able to partner and be able to partner with scholars at other institutions. And so a lot of the way that I've done it is through grants, and then also through ADHO and other organizations to be able to do the organizational things, to be able to partner with institutions has also been another way that I've kind of done this over time.
And I was thinking too about one of the things I always tell my graduate students and new professors is, while it's important you have colleagues in the department, your most important communities, your scholarly communities, are not in your institution, because at least for digital humanists, there's not many of us. So really your partners, your friends, your colleagues that really matter to the kind of work you're able to produce, and the responses to your work are out there. So COVID has actually presented a moment where, through even just this kind of online seminar, my graduate students have been able to make contacts. Twitter has seemed to be reinvigorated, for good and for bad, for digital humanists at this moment. And I know my students, graduate students, younger professors really have benefited from the collaborations that are there. They can't see people for cocktails at a conference, but they can talk to people throughout a presentation and afterwards. One graduate student who's working with me does a sort of more hardcore computational work than I do. And I've told him from the beginning, you're going to have to go out and find people who can read and respond to the algorithmic side of your work. And he has. So outward looking, community building work in the digital humanities, I think, is easier because we are on Twitter, we are doing these kinds of engagements. And COVID has really forced it home, for good or for bad also.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if we have anybody else who would like to add a thought or a question. I did want to ask you about how some of the material that you showed us is contextualized when it is when it appears as part of, you know, a university archive, because that is beyond me, to be honest. But also I understand that I don't really have experience of because I guess, you know, I am a Greek person. So like really this is, to me, is part of like history, but it is not kind of like, you know, part of my personal history in the same way. So I wonder how, for me, the equivalent would be like Nazi memorabilia, right? It's just like, how are these photographs, the school book photographs that, yeah, we saw before, contextualized when they appear in context?
Yeah, I can talk about that because it was a really interesting moment. So our yearbooks have been online for a while now, but what they decided to do in the university library, actually put together a committee, including our Africana Studies librarian, and they had a conversation about, what do we do with these things, right? These are part of our historical record, but obviously at some point somebody's going to go, oh, that's my grandfather wearing a robe, right? And also, what happens when you have these blatant, I didn't show you the blackface pictures, but there's blackface pictures in there. What happens when you put this out there in the world in a digital context? And what the library decided to do was that they didn't want to censor anything at all, but they put a statement on the front page, which sort of said, you know, here are these images, these are historical. We do not agree with them, right? And which seems kind of a fluffy thing to do in some ways, like a lawyery way, but it needed to be said, right? Like it needed to be contextualized. And it was interesting because I published a chapter in the debates book on sort of how white scholars sort of interact with these materials. What happens when you're a white scholar working in an institution which has these histories? And it came out right around the time that a lot of the blackface scandals came out in the United States, involved and Canada with Trudeau, actually, involving the governor of Virginia, for example. And what I found out, which is really interesting, is once this hit, all these yearbooks online were combed by journalists, right? And they're like, well, these were at A&M and these were so-and-so and so-and-so. What I found out that was very interesting is a lot of universities which perceived themselves to be liberal, particularly in the Northeast corridor, pulled their images. So they censored the history, which to me, I think is wrong. I think that is absolutely, we cannot have these conversations if you try to pretend that we've solved all the problems and never had this history. I won't say the university because I'm not sure anymore, but I know for sure there was at least several universities that just pulled all their yearbooks down because they didn't want the journalists to find their blackface pictures. So I think that's the wrong tack to take. The other thing I can say about this is a lot of times our students don't know these histories and they need to understand the history in which they're sitting in. So for example, I remember distinctly, we were working on a project in the library. I always take my students to the library, and one of my Latina students was leafing through this yearbook and she said, why aren't there any women or people of color here? And I just looked at her and I thought, you don't know the history of the university you came to at all. And it was sort of this weird moment. And I thought, of course she doesn't. Of course she doesn't. So I think that's why it's important to have these discussions.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to actually add just on that topic that I said before we started this conversation that I wanted to invite the two of you before I knew what the series was even really going to be about, or kind of like what kind of form it's going to take. And part of the reason why is to do with that, because I guess when we started thinking about digital humanities, a lot of the suggestions were, archival projects by white men. And of course, a lot of it is to do with kind of like what people have seen before and what, they remember. But actually, I think even though I hate that idea of the student being a customer, at the same time, I think at least we have the power to ask for the things that we want. This was us basically saying this is what we want. So it was really great that you actually accepted and that you're here and we've had this conversation and this talk from Texas, so far away. Yes, I think most people, it's quite late here, are sort of on their way out. So I just wanted to say thank you and basically allow you some space if you had some final thoughts or something that you really wanted to add but didn't get a chance to.
Toniesha, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just say thank you so much for the invitation. I really hope that we'll be able to do this in person someday, because I think that would be awesome. But even just doing it this way has been really great. And so I just want to say thank you, and it's been a lot of fun. I think one of the things that I will also say about these kinds of conversations, and I think Amy will probably agree, is that when you're invited to come back and revisit a publication, it also gives us a moment to kind of think about, like, and we laughed a lot about this when we were prepping for this presentation, of all of the things we didn't think about when we were earlier in our careers that now we're like, we probably should have thought that through. That could have gone really badly. But we were so, I think, also both very confident in what we knew we wanted
out of these projects for ourselves as scholars, as individuals, but also what we knew we wanted to share with other people. And so it's really nice to be invited to have a talk like this, because at least for me, I can say it confirms that what Amy and I knew we wanted to put forward in this conversation is what we put forward. And so it was definitely a risk worth taking. And so thank you.
Listen, thank you from me as well. It's nice to hear, it's really nice to hear what different groups sort of see as important within this moment, both culturally and within this moment in terms of the field. And what I take away from this is that a lot of the good work that I think we will see in the future will come out of conversations like this, and your group sort of saying, these are the things we care about. I think digital humanities, for all of its issues now, is still a young enough discipline that there's still a real possibility to move it in different directions. So I guess what I would say to you all is, you have a moment now, you have ideas about where this might go and what's interesting about this work. And so I commend you all in sort of saying, we care about these things, this is where we want to go with it. And I hope you continue to move in that direction. Even when you come up against resistances, both maybe within and outside the field, but there's some real possibilities here. And the impact is not just in the very scholarly sense, it has real impact on the larger community that you live in and the larger world. So please, please keep going.
Okay, thank you both so much for being with us. And thank you to everybody who has stuck it out and is still here with us, probably eating dinner behind their cameras. I hope that you'll be out for making this available for more people to sort of watch back, but we'll talk about this at a different point. And yes, thank you everyone. Thank you also to Lucia, who was here. Yes. Okay. I want to say good night, but it's actually, I'm very aware it's just the middle of the day for the two of you, but
oh no, it's good night for you guys and good afternoon for us.
Exactly.
Have a nice evening, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you for organizing this.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.